Well, we are continuing this month and into October as well, going through the Psalms of Ascents. Those are the collection within the book of the Psalms that were songs sung by the people of Israel as they were going up to Jerusalem for worship. And we're using those to kind of see what messages do they have for us, what lessons do they have for us in how we can rise above our circumstances today as we look to God, as we see who we are in our relationship with Him. And so the first week we looked at how we are watched over by our Father. Last week we saw how we are chosen by God. And this week we're going to be looking at how we are restored by God. So we're going to be looking, as you see up there, at Psalms 123, 124, and 126, but we're starting with 126. And so as we turn to this, I invite you, as you're able, to stand as we open God's Word together. And I'll be just reading all of Psalm 126. Psalmist writes, "When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, 'The Lord has done great things for them.' The Lord has done great things for us, and we were filled with joy. Restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them." May God add His blessing to this word. You can be seated. You know, as we look at this collection of songs, the Psalms of Ascents, they almost certainly were not written all at the same time. They weren't written just for the purpose necessarily of going up to Jerusalem in worship, but they were brought together at a later time. Two of them are actually attributed to David, one of them to King Solomon, although we're not completely sure. Some very ancient traditions don't have those bylines on there, so we don't know for sure. But some of them are songs of praise, looking back at God's work in people's lives or looking forward expectantly to worship. Others are songs of lament or petition. We saw one of those the first week, asking God for His help in the midst of difficulty. Going up to Jerusalem really took on special significance after Judah spent 70 years in exile in Babylon. And it seems that this was most likely the context that Psalm 126 was written from. The people are celebrating God's restoration, bringing them back to the land, to the place where they could gather in worship again. And when I think about that, my memory goes back to when Ginger and I were teaching in China, and our organization had an annual conference in Thailand during the semester break, and teachers from all different countries would come together at that time. And as I've shared before, there was something so powerful about worship during conference, because you had people in countries, serving in countries where gathering for worship, especially as foreigners, could be challenging, and we had to be careful about how we did that. And our team gathered as just a group of 5 in someone's living room just to worship together. And coming together with 200 or 300 people who were just as starved for worship as we were. I still get choked up thinking about it now, 15 years later. Worship becomes so much more meaningful when we can experience time without it. And it makes me sad and frustrated at how easy it is in our country, when we have such freedom to worship, how much we take it for granted. But when we have been without it and then experience that restoration, It's so much more powerful. And that's what we're looking at today. The people were talking about being restored by God. And I want us to think about what that means. What does it mean for us as the people of God to be restored? And how does seeing ourselves individually and corporately, how does seeing ourselves as restored help us to go up toward God? So a few things I want us to consider about that. The first is that we need to be restored. Now, when I think of this word restored, where my brain goes is, as a car guy, it goes to cars. And last Monday, my days off right now are a lot of time driving over to my mom's over in Pennsylvania and helping her get ready to move. And part of my job with that is getting my dad's old cars ready. One of them we're trying to sell, and this old GMC pickup truck, we're getting ready to bring it over here. And I'm trying to get it running so it's easier to get it on the trailer to bring it. And so last Monday I was working at putting a new gas tank in there, pulling the seat out because the gas tank's right in the cab behind the seat, wonderfully safe place for it. But putting a new one in there, and unfortunately wasn't able to get it to make noise because I didn't have enough gas with me and ran out of time to get to the pickup. But trying to get it back on the road. It's been 17 years since that thing was on the road, and hoping to get it back there sometime here. But what does it mean if somebody's talking about restoring a car? What does that mean? Making it like new. Yeah, getting it back to the way it was originally. And often that means you tear it all apart, fix it up, put all the parts back together again. And everything is new, everything is refurbished. It's the way it was when it left the showroom. And I have, besides that truck, I have an old orange BMW, and people often ask me if I restored it. And I haven't. My dad bought it new, and there's a picture of him with me a few years ago before he passed. And so I just try to keep after it. Now, it was repainted from kind of that belt line down after we were rear-ended 22 years ago. I have replaced the clutch and the transmission and the drive shaft. I've rebuilt the suspension, changed the ignition system over, repadded the seats. At some point, an old car starts to become the ship of Theseus or Abe Lincoln's axe, you know. It has essentially been restored, just not all at once. Car guys talk about that as a rolling restoration, sometimes rolling more than others. But, you know, restoration implies that things are not the way that they should be. The Psalm 126 talks about restore us like streams in the Negev. Now, the Negev is the desert to the south and east of Israel. And what they're referring to there are what we would often call wadis. They're temporary rivers. They were dry most of the time, but that could be, of course, very disappointing and even dangerous for travelers who were thirsty and looking for water, and they'd come up and find a dry stream bed. But when the rains came, even if it wasn't right at that location, even if it was up in the mountains, suddenly those wadis, those streams in the Negev, could swell with water to the point of flash flooding. But you know, riverbeds are meant for water. And so the people are saying, Lord, restore us. We're meant for water. We're meant for your refreshment and your power in our midst. Restore us again. You know, we have to see that we need restoration as well, individually and as the people of God. We are not the way we should be, despite our best efforts to cover that up. Deep down, we all know that. And often we only see this, as I was talking about that gentleman at the Apple Festival earlier. Often it's only through trials that we really start to see that. Psalm 123, 2 verses from that, verses 3 and 4, says this: "Have mercy on us, Lord, have mercy on us, for we have endured no end of contempt. We have endured no end of ridicule from the arrogant, of contempt from the proud." There can be a grace in experiencing pain, whether that's from others or from the consequences of our own choices or the brokenness of this fallen world. There can be a grace in that because it can help us to see our need to be restored. And I think more than that, it can help us to feel our need to be restored in a way that just theoretical ideas never can. I think it's part of the reason that I've come to realize persecution is not necessarily a bad thing for the church if it draws us closer to Him. But once we realize our need to be restored, we have to realize something else, very important. God needs to restore us. We can't do it ourselves. That old GMC pickup was parked 17 years ago because the brakes went out on it. And somehow, over 17 years, that master cylinder has not fixed itself. I don't know why. I keep waiting for it, but it's just still there under the truck, leaking brake fluid. All the self-help books in the world can't restore us. They might be helpful to some degree, but they can't get at the core of our problems. We can't fix ourselves. Psalm 124 gets at this. It says, "If the Lord had not been on our side," let Israel say, "if the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive when their anger flared against us. The flood would have engulfed us, the torrent would have swept over us, the raging waters would have swept us away. Praise be to the Lord, who has not let us be torn by their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the fowler's snare. The snare has been broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." One of the great myths of our culture is the myth of the self-made man. In many ways, I think it's central to the American dream that we can lift ourselves up, but we so carefully need to guard against pride, against thinking that we can save ourselves, because we can't. The reality is we don't even have a good picture of what we're truly supposed to be. We know things are wrong, but we can't completely picture what it's like for things to be right. God is our maker, as the psalm says. He knows how we were made to be, and He controls the outcome of history. It occurred to me as I was thinking about this that there's a danger in thinking about our being restored. There's actually a danger in looking back, because it's very easy to just get rose-colored glasses or get an incorrect picture of the way things are supposed to be. It's very easy to think, things were simpler then, life was better then. But when you're talking about restoring cars, there's a thing that we talk about over-restoring cars. Because if you think back, how many of you had a car that rusted out within like 3 or 4 years? They don't build them like they used to, and that's a good in some ways. With my old BMW, I'm on a online message board where people share tips about fixing them up and so on. And I remember one time somebody was asking, there are these supports for the radiator behind the grills, and they were wondering, are they supposed to be the color of the body, or are they black, or what are you supposed to do? And somebody replied to that and said, they're supposed to be black. And a lot of people will take and spray it on with, mask it off carefully and spray it on with paint and even clear coat over that on the supports there. And they said, but if you want to be accurate to the way it left the factory, you need to get some black paint and apply it sloppily with a brush as though it's 3 o'clock on a Friday and you're already 2 beers into the weekend. That's how it left the factory. Often, the way things weren't quite as good as we would like to think. Certainly not for everybody. And even the very best ideas that we have of how life is supposed to be are flawed, because we've never known the way life was supposed to be. The book of Genesis is really pretty vague about life before the fall, because we've forgotten. We've forgotten what the purity and the innocence of the garden was really like, because we've never known it. We caught a glimpse of real life in Jesus, but we have yet to see what we shall be. John writes about this. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. All who have this hope in him purify themselves, just as he is pure. And this is a way that people are not like cars, because our restoration isn't so much going back to the way we left the showroom, it's going forward. It's not going back to what we were, but letting God take us forward into what he has destined us to be. And only he can do it. So we need to approach him in humility. The very beginning of Psalm 123 says this, I lift up my eyes to you who sit enthroned in heaven. As the eyes of slaves look to the hand of their master, as the eyes of a female slave look to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God till he shows us his mercy. Now, this is a challenging picture for us as we look at this. Because, we balk today at this idea of slavery, and we should. Now, slavery in the ancient world was different than slavery in America in 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. In Israel, it was actually supposed to be something of a social safety net, at least in part. Those in poverty could sell themselves into indentured servitude so they could avoid starving. And God told masters to let their slaves go free every 7 years, sending them out with provisions, with gifts and skills to enable them to start over as free people. Now, people were just as messed up then as they are now, and that certainly often led to abuse, treating people as property, dehumanizing them. But I think this picture in Psalm 123 is something of an idealized picture of that. This kind of indentured servitude, of people seeking mercy when they had nowhere else to turn, and finding someone who was willing to show that to them. It's not perfect, but I think that's the picture they're trying to paint here. And the reality is we all need God's mercy. We don't want what's coming to us. We can't restore ourselves. I don't deserve to be restored. We can only rely on God's mercy. So we need to be restored, and only God can do it. Another important thing for us to realize is that restoration is a process. It has a cost. And I've never completely restored a car, partly because of time, but also because I just can't afford it. Get into all the paint and everything and mechanical work, it's a lot of money. Restoring people is a far greater cost, more than you and I can pay. But Jesus paid it for you and for me through his sinless life and through his death on the cross. He paid the cost. But restoration is often still painful for us. As Psalm 124 says, we'll often go through the floodwaters. We may spend time in a snare. And letting God tear us down and build us back isn't easy. Cutting out rust isn't comfortable. Sometimes it can feel like we're being taken off the road and we don't know the timetable for getting back. We might even get back on a completely different road altogether. But we need to have patience with his process in us and in other people. One of the big things to decide when restoring a car is what to tackle first, Should you rebuild the engine or do the body work, recover the seats, redo the brakes? What's it going to be? Something I've realized is that God almost never works in other people in the order that I think he should. God, you're going to take care of that in them, right? Right? He says, no, I'm working in this right now. And God probably doesn't work in me in the order that you think he should either. I heard someone once describe restoration projects by saying this: the middle makes no sense. If we can't see the end, if we don't know what something is becoming, the middle part of the restoration often doesn't make any sense whatsoever. A friend of mine once had a rolling restoration, a car that he drove around while he was fixing it up. And for a while, he was driving it in 5 different colors of paint and primer while he was doing the body work on it. He made it look a lot worse in order to make it look better. We can't always see how our circumstances, the changes of life, our pain and our trials, we aren't always going to see how they come together. But we have to trust God in the process. Paul talked about something in his life that he desperately wanted God to restore. There's been a lot of speculation about what that was. We don't know. But he said this to the church in Corinth: "In order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.' Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." God's unfinished work in us should keep us humble. We need to rely on his power in our weakness, and we need to keep praising him for the work he has already done, even in the midst of insults and hardships, persecutions, and difficulties. And even though the work is his, he calls us to support his work in us, to come alongside him. We read the tail end of Psalm 126. It's that beautiful picture there. It says, "Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them." We can't restore ourselves, but God invites us into the work. We might not know what we're becoming, but he asks us to walk into the fields with him on the journey of faith. We can't make the seeds grow, but he asks us to help plant them, to water them, to tend them, to pull out the weeds, and then sometimes, eventually, to reap, to bring home the bundles of grain. And he calls us to rejoice as we go through that process. Because restoration is cause for rejoicing. In Psalm 126, the beginning of that gives us that powerful picture of how we rejoice at his restoration. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. You know, restoration should lead us to joy, to praise. In the book of Acts, Peter and John encountered a man begging outside the temple. He was lame, he couldn't walk. Peter said, "Silver or gold I do not have, but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." Taking him by the right hand, he helped him up, and instantly the man's feet and ankles became strong. He jumped to his feet and began to walk. Then he went with them into the temple courts, walking and jumping and praising God. The man's leaping around, offering praise to God. He was over 40 years old. It wasn't a very dignified thing to be doing at that time. And I think, I don't often jump and shout and run around in praise to God. But maybe I should. Because the restoration of people leads to joy in heaven. Jesus told 3 lost parables in Luke 15 about the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost sons. When he was telling about the lost coin, he said this, "When she finds it, the woman calls her friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin.' In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." Jesus tells us that we should rejoice at the restoration of others and of ourselves. That's part of the joy of baptism when we're able to celebrate that, a public rejoicing over God's restoration of someone's life. But so often, I need to remind myself to rejoice. We need to remind one another. Psalm 126 looks back to the return from exile, just as the people of Israel were continually being pointed back to the Exodus. Remember to rejoice. Because life is hard. It can be easy to get discouraged by our circumstances, and we need to remind ourselves of our restoration. Remind one another to look up, to see him, and to rejoice. And our rejoicing should be a witness to other people, too. And there's that little 2 lines in Psalm 126 where it says, "Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them." One of the most powerful testimonies to Jesus is the simple story, here's how God is restoring my life. Here's how I'm different today because of him. That's something that people can't refute, they can't argue with, and it gives him all of the praise. There's one last thing, a very important thing that we need to remember. Our full restoration is yet to come. Something that occurred to me as I was reading over this that's interesting about Psalm 126. It starts out by praising God for restoring the fortunes of Zion and acknowledging that he has done great things for them. But then just a few verses later, they call to God, "Restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev." Now, wait a second. They just said that the Lord already restored the fortunes of Zion. So are they just ungrateful? Are they just greedy? No. They were just acknowledging they still needed work. They were back in the land, but they were still rebuilding. The restoration was still ongoing. In one sense, actually, they never saw that full restoration the way that they were looking for it. There was never again a king, a descendant of David, sitting on a throne in Jerusalem. Israel never again enjoyed the power and the significance that they had under David and Solomon. They were mostly a backwater province of one empire after another, under the thumb of rulers who didn't know the Lord. And then, just a generation after Jesus, the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was burned. We need to keep seeking God's restoration. We can't rest on where we are. A lot of times it's tempting to just check off the boxes of, I said that certain prayer, I asked Jesus into my heart, I got baptized, and now I can just get on with life. I think that's a root cause of so much of the hypocrisy and pain that we see within the church. When people within the church stop God's restoration work in their own lives, in their own hearts, but still demand that other people check off the certain boxes, the certain behaviors, so that they can be included. And Jesus told the Pharisees they weren't wrong to be concerned about outward behaviors, but they were wrong for neglecting their own hearts and ignoring God's mercy and his justice toward themselves and toward others especially. Because God loves us. He loves all of us just the way we are. And he loves us way too much to leave us there. He wants to continue his restoration work in us, continue shaping us into what we will be. And that should fill us with grace for one another. And we can have confidence in the midst of that, even when it's painful, even when the middle makes no sense, because God has promised that he will restore all things. We get that beautiful picture in the last couple chapters of the book of Revelation. John had this vision. He said, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth," that Isaiah wrote about. "For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' He who is seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.'" Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." You and I need to be restored. God has to do it, because you and I can't fix ourselves. And that's going to be a process. But it should lead us to rejoicing, because he is making everything new. And as the Lord restores us, may it be said among the nations, may it be said among the people of Elyria, "The Lord has done great things for them," because he has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy.